thank you so much for your time. How's the book launch coming along?
Well, it hasn't officially launched yet.
Well, soon to be, huh?
Yeah, we're in the pre-launch phase right now. It's all going well. This is all so new to me. I'm a yoga teacher. I show up in my room and I do my job and I teach. And I decided to write a book and not really thinking about how much newness there was going to be to this, including pre-launch and launch and marketing and all of this stuff that, when you're a yoga teacher, you don't really give a lot of thought to. Mm-hmm. So I'm in a different phase in my career and a different phase in my learning. And the launch is just a part of it. So it's been pretty wonderful. Students seem to be really enthusiastic and supportive, which makes me very happy. And so we'll see. I'll let you know soon. I go on tour starting September 5th, and I'll be on tour for 6 weeks.
Beautiful. Well, the title is it carries a lot. It's a powerful title. It's very provocative. It feels very timely. But before we dive into the book a little bit more, I'd love for our listeners to get to know you some more, for those that don't know you anyway. So could you talk a little bit about what brought you to yoga initially?
I can only look back in hindsight and with an enormous amount of gratitude and think about the ways in which I guess the universe conspired to bring me into a space of healing, because it wasn't very natural to my upbringing or to the environment in which I was raised, which was in northern New Jersey. Kind of a blue collar, middle, it's just like a typical small town, not necessarily progressive, but only 30 minutes outside of Manhattan. But things like spirituality, alternative healing, those were things that were frowned upon, mocked even. And I moved to New York City at 17, and I happened to get a job down on the Lower East Side, or rather the East Village, on 10th and Avenue B, called Life Cafe. Life Cafe was owned by David Life, and Sharon Gannon was a waitress there, and Eddie Stern was a delivery boy there. And why that's significant is because Eddie and Sharon went on to open Jivamukti Yoga, and Eddie Stern went on to open the Ashtanga Yogashala in New York. And so I was 17 years old and immersed in an environment where the newness of yoga was very present in their experience, and their influence on me was great. I also was standing on the precipice, though, because I was still just 17 years old. My other jobs were nightclubs. And so I did a lot of drugs and partied with the best of them. And so on one hand, I was oriented to the scene, the party scene. And yet I was also being exposed to yoga and philosophy and veganism, and being asked to really consider things like my language, to consider things like my diet. And I straddled both of those worlds for a little while until yoga really, thankfully, drew me more towards that side. And the more I practiced and the more I cultivated those tools, the less interested I was in drinking or doing drugs or acting out or eating meat. Those things just very naturally fell away from me. It wasn't like I had addiction or any of that. Although I gave it my best shot, it just wasn't in my constitution. But yoga at a very early age helped me to turn my back on substances that I was using to self-regulate, to actually find practices for natural self-regulation so I could show up in the world in a more integrated way. And so that's really when I discovered it. When it kind of fell onto me. Mm-hmm. I would say the first time I got on a mat, though, even though I had heard about yoga and it was in my environment, I didn't actually get on a mat until around 86. So I was around 19 years old. But prior to that, certainly the concepts of yoga were in my awareness.
Mm. And in your, I've heard you share, and I think you write about it in your book as well. I look forward to reading your experience of seeking the guru, which I'd like for us to talk about, that common I mean, the common traps that come along with seeking, but often as well the common traps that come with seeking the guru. And I'd love to hear your experience of that.
Sure. So for years, when I first started getting into yoga, I didn't have a spiritual practice. I was raised agnostic in my upbringing, both Catholic and Jewish in my family. My parents didn't want to raise us with any religion. So we were really devoid of that. We celebrated any holiday that gave a gift. And there was a lot of love in my house, but there was really no devotion to anything outside of just the family. And so I was very superstitious about, or suspicious rather, about God, because the information that I picked up was patriarchal, was punishing, indifferent in a way, and I didn't want anything to do with that. And so when I first got into asana, anything that had to do with gods or multiple gods, I rejected, and I just focused on the physical part of the practice. In time, as I evolved, there were shifts that happened very organically. My practice went from something that was very physical for probably the first 6 or so years of my practice to something that was very emotional. And I didn't understand, of course, trauma. I didn't understand the mind-body connection. I didn't understand that when you release tension in your body, these emotions that are trapped in the body can be released. And as that started to happen in the progression of my practice, the more I was able to tap into the emotion and really unpack the trauma that was held in my body, the better I felt, the more connected I felt, the more available. That contraction became expansion. And that expansion, every once in a while, gave me glimpses of a feeling of surrender. And in those moments where I was safe enough within myself to actually let go of everything that I thought I knew, I would have a felt experience of something beyond me or even my ego. Something like love, but not just love for families or animals, something bigger than that. And I recognized that I was getting a glimpse into perhaps what spirituality was, and I wanted more. I was such a beginner. And in some ways, it's a really good thing because I didn't have any prejudice to get in my way around what spirituality is. But I really had no guidance. And at that time, this is in the 90s, the practice really asked you to take on a guru. And the guru was considered the dispeller of darkness. The guru was the direct conduit to grace. That part of the deal with that dynamic was that you had to surrender your will to the guru. And in return, you might receive Shaktipat. You might receive a direct transmission. Now, I had spent many years in therapy prior to this for a variety of reasons, because of trauma and because of all the emotional release that I was experiencing. And I had literally spent thousands of dollars in therapy learning how to call my power back, learning how to reframe my narratives. So opening myself up to the guru-student relationship was already a little bit challenging for me because, I'm being taught to call my power back, and here I am being told I have to give my power away. So there was something incongruent about it. Yet at the same time, I really wanted someone to tell me how to live my life. Like, I was kind of thrilled by that prospect. And so I spent a lot of time here in the United States, going to different ashrams, working with different teachers, and it never connected for me. And I always felt that, perhaps they say that, the teacher appears when the student is ready, and the teacher wasn't appearing. So I presumed it was because I wasn't ready, and that bummed me out. So I decided to go to India. I figured I can go to India, it's the birthplace of yoga, and this is where I'll find my guru. And that it's in the book. It takes me on a very significant journey into meeting with some very beloved gurus to really discover where the true teacher lies. And it's the idea that, there's a saying, if you see the Buddha, kill the Buddha. And it's not literal, of course, but that you really have to let go of these projections about what the guru is and discover it within yourself. And so that was a portion. That's a little glimpse for you into like my trajectory with that. As a female leader in the United States of yoga, I've seen too much abuse of power happen because of these unequal power dynamics that exist. When you come into yoga, more often than not, there's a reason why people are healing. They're vulnerable. Unless the teacher is really grounded within themselves, it's fairly effortless to get seduced into buying into the projections that the students often very naturally will have towards someone who's in a position of power. For me, the onus has to be on the person in authority to anticipate those projections, to understand the way projection works, and to be hyper vigilant not to exploit those that transference. And what I see very often is an exploitation of that vulnerability. And as a result, we see a lot of abuse of power. And so I write about this in my book because I believe that the guru lives within you. My story to India, the first time, which was a very disappointing one, and yet also incredibly blessed. Disappointing because I couldn't find my guru. And I met with Patabi Joyce, I met with Amma, and I went to Sri Aurobindo's ashram. And just one thing happened after another that was affirming to me, like, nope, this is not it. This is not it. And in the book, I don't want to give away the story, but in the book, I share a story that opens my mind and helps me to understand that every moment in life is the guru. Whether it's a light moment or a shadowed moment, there's not a single person, there's not a single experience that isn't fodder for our illumination. And that we can't seek something that exists within us. We have to awaken to it. And why I share so much in the book about this dynamic, this unhealthy dynamic, is because as I was writing the book, there were stories I was avoiding because I didn't want to be controversial. I didn't want to lose relationships because of, the yoga community is kind of like the mafia in some ways. It's like you don't talk out against the family. And in these stories, I get pretty specific because I had to, because I realized the reason I didn't want to is, like I said, is because of my own concern and fear. But I realized I was part of a culture of secrecy. And it's that culture of secrecy that allows for these teachers to become elevated and gives them permission to perpetuate this abuse. And that I'm no healthier than the person who's actually participating in this abuse until I actually speak up and out. And so that's what I share about a lot within that all of us have to take accountability, that we all have to speak out, and we all have to take ownership for the true guru that lives within.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. It's huge. That culture of secrecy. And it seems like it's getting even more amplified in our current times with President Trump, and even in Australia, a very similar Trump-type person has been elected, similar in Europe. I mean, it's happening all around the world, these kind of leaders that are modeling this culture of secrecy, and it's been normalized and being kind of okay to lie. People have kind of been desensitized to that whole thing, yet through conversations you're bringing to the table and this transparency that's happening as well, it seems to be also sweeping from under the rug all of that secrecy and denial and defensiveness. So it's very interesting times. And where Where do you see that all going, both in the yoga community with this whole guru dynamic shifting, much more wisdom collectively being brought into that, and then also the collective? Where are you seeing it in this current time of madness where there's so much polarity between the extreme left and the extreme right? And similar in the yoga communities, this whole kind of Me Too movement has brought up like beautiful healing, allowing people to really heal trauma, but it's also having people dig their heels in and kind of get defensive as well. Where are you seeing it in the yoga community, where we're going, and the collective?
Well, what I'll say is that as a spiritualist, I can't help but step back and wonder why things happen as they do. That this is a very accelerated time, and there's a lot of shadowed behavior that's so public, that's so steeped in ego and in patriarchy and fundamentalism and dogma, that's deliberately poised to create both suffering and separation. And that is, like you said, normalizing the drive to create oppression. All of this is the opposite of the practice that we're a part of, opposite of yoga, which is about integration and wholeness. But what I do feel is that what's been happening, I mean, it's all awful and terrible. Like, I will own, like, there's not a day that goes by that I don't watch the TV and listen to the news and I think, what the fuck? And there's also a thought, you can't change what you won't see. And the truth is, there's nothing happening within our global leadership that we aren't all participating in our own way each and every day. None of us are exempt from participating in bias and prejudice and racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, ageism, ableism. If we can't not contribute to that, otherwise we'd be enlightened. So therefore, in our own tiny little ways, sometimes it's overt, sometimes it's subtle, but we're doing the very same thing that our leadership is doing. It's just that what they're doing is just so people's lives are at stake. The thing about this that I can't help but feel, if we can get through it, and that's a real big if, what's getting excavated is the trauma that has not been addressed. Trump and many of these leaders are using language and are being strategic in their commitment to oppress, that those who have been oppressed are outraged. Those of us who haven't been impacted, and when I say those of us, I include like myself, part of the white dominant culture, what was conveniently hidden from us, all of a sudden we're like, wow, that never went away. That has always been what folks on the margins have been dealing with. But it's actually been convenient for someone like myself not to actually have to go towards it because it doesn't affect me personally. But now that it's been excavated, you can't not see what's happening. But the problem is that without tools, what the government is doing in excavating this rage is that rage is meeting rage. Fear is meeting fear. Anger is meeting anger. And we all know what happens. That's an ingredient for explosion. So what people like myself have to do, who actually do have access to tools, do have the resources, do have platforms, is to invite people into accountability, to say that we need to provide tools for self-regulation. We need to find ways to name what is happening right now and help people to be able to navigate the triggers that are happening so that we can actually find a way to communicate without this implosion, but also about people like myself who have been able to kind of live on the outskirts quite easily, to recognize, like, no, we are responsible for this. I create separation each and every day. I participate in oppression each and every day. And until I take accountability for that and dismantle the systems within myself that create oppression, then the systems that exist that create policy to keep people oppressed can't change. Systems are just made up of people. Change the people, you change the system. So my commitment is I want to change the people. I want them, and the only way I can do that is by modeling what it looks like to take ownership for my own bias and how I can use the tools so that in the impulse to create separation, I know how to take a breath, feel it in my body, and make a different choice. And so I can't help but think if we survive this, we will transform the cultures forever. It's like this toxic sludge is finally being excavated from the darkest core of the earth's, like of America's soul. And now that that sludge is exposed, the question is like for society, now what are you going to do with that? And it requires conscious action. But conscious action without accountability is still arrogant. It's still divisive. And so I try to keep really optimistic. As dark as this culture can go is as light as it is. And there are a lot of people doing incredible work in the world, especially folks on the margins. I'm doing more listening than ever to leadership of color and leadership of varying ethnicity, abilities, age, to try to understand what from their experience is truly going on and what someone like me needs to do in response to that. In some cases, it's to get out of the way. In some cases, it's to use my privilege as a way to try to protect someone else from harm. So I'm optimistic and at the same time fairly fatigued. And I know that that is the strategy of our administrations. They want us fatigued. So we've got to do yoga and meditate and pray and cry and rage and scream and be together in community and not allow those in power. And I use that word with a lot of resistance because that's not what true, that's a dark ego power. But those in power who are responsible for our safety, our security, our health and wellness, we need to hold them accountable, but we can't do that until we hold ourselves accountable for the ways in which we contribute to this very dysfunction.
Yeah, that broad view is so necessary. And adding to that, the current times of, for lack of a better word, like chronic distraction. So much distraction. It's easy to see all that of what you just said and to go, fuck, like what can I do about it? Just small old me. Yeah. And then just scroll through the phone in that kind of fatigue that you're describing. And it seems like that's going on as well, which again comes back to that responsibility, taking responsibility to turn that fucking phone off and do something that'll create that clarity to see what's actually going on. But I mean, for so many, including myself, it took something like, for me, chronic fatigue for me to start paying more attention. And I think that's pretty common as well. People getting so fatigued in this mess we're in that becomes the kind of sludge to start paying more attention. So for people out there that are like, yeah, that makes sense, awesome, but I'm fucking overwhelmed, I'm fatigued, I got this to do and that to do. What do I do? And it can seem like too much, but just to make that choice, make that the responsibility, even just to get on the mat and quiet down and open up is huge. And then it seems to unfold from there. But I think the immensity of where we're at right now can seem like too much for the individual. Mm-hmm. But that inner work that is precious. And as we each can feel rejuvenated and pay more attention, it all seems to unfold quite organically from that. We have more vitality for more conscious communication and better relationships, and there's an organic unfoldment, it seems.
Yep. Whenever I think about that for myself, you got to have skin in the game. And what I mean by that is, you and I are having this conversation. We're talking about, what is truth? What is love? What is God? What is healing? What is, we're in this is democracy, even spiritual democracy. We get to ask these questions and ponder what our response is. I know that that's a privilege, because most of the people in the world, would literally be killed or jailed doing what you and I are doing right now, so liberally, because of systemic, religious, political oppression. To challenge the status quo, to have your own point of view, could mean life or death. That's not our reality. So when I get overwhelmed, I think to myself, how dare I? How dare I, when I do have resources and I do have tools and I do know better? How dare I allow the systems to deliberately fatigue me when that's been their strategy all along, when I've had a choice not to allow myself to get sucked in to that particular narrative? And so anyone who's listening, it doesn't mean these great acts that you leave your children behind, you get on a plane and you go serve some other country. There are so many different ways right now in which we can serve and help to shift the consciousness of this planet. And much of it has to do with making sure that we're committed to our own practice, just waking up, doing our yoga, doing our breathing exercises, doing our prayers, because it's going to change the way that we experience ourselves and the world around us. It's going to shift the contraction into expansion. And maybe it's just for one day, but that one day, you're going to be nicer to your kids. You're going to be more compassionate to the people that you meet out in the world. And that has a strong effect. And as that becomes something that is more solidified within their bodies, perhaps then they'll have the bandwidth to create more and more conscious action that can ease this world towards peace. But it requires a certain amount of effort. And I hope that people recognize that we get to do this. Like, we get to. And that's a privilege I will never take for granted. So if it means me having to be a little uncomfortable here and there, to have to confront some of my own limiting beliefs, to have to go up against the little voice in my head that says, well, who am I? So be it. That's just all ego and insecurity. I would rather confront that than pull the covers up over my head because I can. Because if I do, then I'm complicit. Like, I know in the practice of yoga, we're taught that, like, I can't be free unless we're all free. My liberation is bound with your liberation. Your liberation is bound with the indigenous folk throughout Australia. My liberation is bound to someone in jail and another side of the world. I have to be as invested in their liberation as I am in my own. Otherwise, I'm the problem. And so for people who are listening, I hope they can really consider that we've been called, especially those of us who do have access to these resources, we've been called to step up, to speak out, to find our voice, to speak truth to power, to love bigger than we ever imagined possible, to be in service, and to do our best not to contribute to the suffering of others. And the only way that we can do that is by taking accountability for our own humanity. And if we can do that, I believe that peace is possible. But why would we expect our leadership, whether it's in Australia or here in the United States, to change if we refuse? And so for me, any revolution, the real revolution begins within. And our individual evolution is collective revolution. So it is dependent on each soul who's listening and to every being in the world.
Yeah. Yes. Seane, please, can you share of your early experiences of yoga? I know I've heard you talk several times about your OCD and your anxieties and traumas that got brought up in the yoga practice. And I think that'll be really helpful for people as well. Because it seems in a lot of offerings of yoga, not a lot of teachers are talking about that experience of when shit hits the wall, or when trauma gets triggered, or when stuff is coming up. There's not a lot of like mature, conscious support for that process. And I meet a lot of not even younger yoga practitioners, just people that experience that initial awakening and bringing up of trauma, but not having the languaging around it or the support or conversation. So I know you've talked quite liberally about your experience of that. Could you share quite elaborately on that experience of your bringing up of trauma and all that?
Sure. Well, when I first got into yoga, like I said, it was very physical, and I liked it. It felt good, but it was also starting to bring up these compulsive patterns that I had, which at that time, it wasn't diagnosed as obsessive compulsive disorder, because when it started for me when I was around 7, there wasn't a name for it. It was just quirky behavior that I had. And what it was is that I was obsessed with the numbers 4s and 8s. It had anything with even numbers. I gravitated towards odd numbers. Would give me anxiety. So if someone touched me 3 times, that could cause anxiety to rise up in my body, and I would obsess until I could figure out how to get them to touch me in the exact same spot one more time, so it would equal 4. So I spent a lot of time blinking in even numbers, swallowing in even numbers. If you had to tell me that you loved me 4 times at night, when my mother would put the blanket on me, she would lift it up and it had to fall evenly on my body, which, by the way, is impossible. And so I would have to make her do it again and again and again until my body felt even. And so there was also superstition attached to it, meaning that if I didn't do these patterns, I was always afraid that someone I loved, usually my mom, was going to die. And, I'm a child, so I was very, very sensitive. And I had this feeling like I could stave off the inevitable doom. And essentially, I could play God. And when I moved to New York City and started to do drugs and alcohol, it was another way for me to self-regulate. See, what I didn't understand was that my OCD, well, I'll get there in a moment. I'll explain what it was in a moment. So I started partying a lot, like I said. Started learning a little bit more about yoga. In yoga, I would notice my body. It's like I had 2 different sides of my body. My right side was different than my left. And for the first time, I could feel this imbalance structurally, and it would give me anxiety. And anxiety would make me kind of nervous. My heart would beat. My jaw would get tight. There'd be like an undercurrent of panic attached to it. There were a lot of various sensations. The only way to change the sensation of the anxiety was through patterning, which actually it regulated my nervous system. I wouldn't have known that then, but that's what it was doing. So my patterning started to get worse when I moved to New York. I had to check doorknobs. Like I would lock the door. I would count 56 steps to get from my apartment down to the ground floor. I'd have to turn around, count the 56 steps going back up, check the doorknob, and do that 4 times. I knew I knew it was locked. It didn't matter. Had to do it. So I decided to get into therapy to understand a little bit more about why this was getting worse. And when I was in therapy, my therapist said to me that he thinks that the reason why I do these patterns is because of my trauma. And I said to my therapist, "What trauma? I don't have any trauma." And the therapist looked at me, he said, "Your molestation." I said, "My molestation? What does that have to do with anything?" And I remember him just kind of cocking his head and staring at me, kind of waiting for me to figure this out. When I was 6 years old, a year before my patterning started, I was sexually molested. But it wasn't something that was secretive in my household. This was something that was acknowledged and it was dealt with to a certain degree. But what also happened in my molestation was I dissociated. And it's the first time that I experienced that separation from my physical body as a form of protection. I floated above myself and watched what was happening as if it was happening to someone else. And I had no feeling, no emotional response to what was happening. Through working with my therapist, he helped me to understand that my patterning was a direct, because my body felt so out of control. And in that moment of molestation, my anxiety, of course, would have been astronomical, but because I was dissociated from it, all of that emotion was suppressed in my system. So the only way to make me feel better was to do things in these, it gave me control over my body. It gave me agency over my body. It helped me, something was so out of control that this was my way of putting like a protection around me. Again, I couldn't have known this as a child. And what happened then was in yoga one day, the teacher accidentally kicks my foot in downward dog. And all of a sudden, the panic comes up. And I start to obsess how I can get this teacher to kick my other foot before I leave the studio. And I was always elaborating on these plans. You know, I would go to say goodbye to him, go to hug him, and then accidentally trip and then kick his foot with my foot. But then what if I kick it in a different spot? Then I'm going to have to figure out how to do both. So it's now even on both sides. And randomly, the teacher says, breathe and everything changes. And so I take a really deep breath. I exhale, nothing changes. I do it again. I exhale. The anxiety actually got worse. I don't know if it was the third breath or the 30th breath, but there was a point where the anxiety lessened, the sensation widened, and I was able to leave the studio without accosting the teacher. And so from that point forward, every time I would feel the impulse to pattern or the walk up the stairs, I would sit and breathe and breathe and breathe until the sensation dissipated. But this was just step one. But that was enough. For years, that's all I did was just breathe and was able to not have to follow through on the impulse. The anxiety turned to something else. It wasn't until I started to have true emotional releases in yoga, when after all that contraction, my body was finally safe enough to release, that I had to go back to the core to understand how that trauma got there in the first place, how to be with the big feelings. Because breathe and everything changes taught me how to detach without awareness. But detachment without awareness is still dissociation. And so a part of my healing was to actually first observe in yoga. What I would notice is as big feelings came up, I would start to fantasize. I would just think about what I was going to do later that day. I would think maybe about the sex I might have or the food I might eat. Or I might check out someone's leggings, wonder a little bit about their life. And it started to occur to me that happened more often than not when I was in these long-held poses, when the sensation would get really intense. To avoid the sensation, I would fantasize. And so I realized on the mat, I don't have access to drugs or alcohol or food. I can't pattern the discomfort away. So now I can use my mind to take me out of present time. And this is when the yoga practice became more and more complex. Was okay, I had to observe the impulse to dissociate and then come back to the sensation. And what would happen is I'd fidget always. And then I'd get angry, usually at the teacher. Why would they fucking shut up? Don't they know they're holding us in this pose too long? But every once in a while, for no reason at all, once I would get past the irritation or the projection, the truth of what was living in my body would get excavated, and that was grief. And I would cry. I would cry on the mat. And those were the big shifts, because those were the moments that allowed me in time to move towards real healing that included forgiveness for myself, forgiveness to my molesters, forgiveness without bypass. I'm not suggesting it was like, oh, I forgive everyone. Everything happens for a reason. It was much more nuanced than that. And it took a lot of time. But it is the truth of the progression. My practice moved from the physical to the emotional to the spiritual. The contraction became expansion. And it was alchemy, meaning the lead of my fear became the gold of my wisdom, but not by pretending that the fear didn't exist. The fear, the rage, the grief, it's all energy. And all of that energy lived in my body, still lives in my body. And if it's not discharged, both physically and emotionally, that emotion suppressed becomes the tension that we live with, tension that keeps us in lockdown, and tension that makes us reactive, especially in conflict and crisis. Thus why, going back to that original thought that my nation is in trauma, because people are getting triggered. Historical ancestral trauma that lives in the body that has not been dealt with is being prodded. And because most of us don't have those skills, people are reacting to that trauma, and they're going towards the rage with an equal amount of rage, and nothing will change. So we've got to find a way to be present with the rage, be present with it, but let it be transformed into something else. And so that's really been really respecting that trauma is real. We all have it. It's both, what's the word? There's shock trauma and there's developmental trauma. Developmental trauma are the traumas that we really need for most of us in this world. Those are the traumas that we experience: divorce, death of a loved one, bullying. But when we experience trauma, chemicals released from the brain, they flood into the body, they put us in fight, flight, freeze, or collapse. In the moment of that particular narrative, the body, in order to protect itself from what it perceives as violence or fear or some assault, the body will contract. In that moment of contraction, that narrative is embedded into the cells and it becomes its own living thing. If that energy is allowed to discharge out, we're able to move through it and open ourselves to the grief. But if we get addicted to the tension, addicted to the sensation of that trauma, and what happens is that becomes cumulative. Every single time we experience something that in the subconscious reminds us of that first insult or assault, that trauma just keeps locking us into our bodies. We don't have any evidence that to discharge that tension would bring us liberation. To discharge that tension in our subconscious means unsafety. And so for me, it took probably 8 years on the mat doing hardcore asana and breath work before my body, physical body, felt safe enough to be able to trust the discharge and let my body naturally move towards surrender, which is what I think most people, they don't understand the phenomenon of yoga. This is just what happens in time. But because our society is so quick to move on, even our yoga practice right now, a lot of the teachers teach it so quickly, don't allow space for the student to linger. And I understand why. A lot of the teachers are young teachers and they want to be liked and they don't want to hold the projection. They don't want that, that the student thinking, fuck them. Like, why are they, talking so much? They want to be liked. They want the student coming back. Not recognizing that actually we have a responsibility as facilitators to hold that discomfort, to not personalize it, to recognize that it is a part of their healing journey, and to not give them the time and the space to indulge in their own discomfort does a great disservice to their growth and is more a reflection of our own ego. So anyway, that's the personal arc.
Thank you. No, I couldn't agree more. I think for the younger teachers that are doing the quicker, more, you could say, distracting forms of yoga, also maybe haven't done enough training to hold space for that depth of transformation. Like, it's a big space to hold when people are truly going deep and shedding tears, and like to hold space for that requires quite a bit of spiritual maturity and depth of one's practice. So if one's only practiced yoga for not even a year, then they're a teacher all of a sudden. Most likely they just don't have the vitality, the awareness, the foresight, whatever, the strength to hold space for that. So I think it seems kind of, again, understandable. Yes. And I think it's good for the younger teachers to kind of be honest with that, because that spiritual bypass is so fucking common, and it can be a thick trap. Mm-hmm. I've met quite a few younger teachers that have reached out in kind of crisis, in which they've admitted, like, holy shit, I've stepped into this role prematurely, especially with like some of the younger teachers stepping into more of the cathartic practices, such as the Kundalini practices and even the neo-tantric practices, where they really welcome the catharsis, and all of a sudden they reach out like, fuck, I've stepped into this role too quick, and they've admitted, like, I'm not ready to hold space for people's shit that much. So it seems kind of understandable to be honest with that as teachers. Like, nah, I'm not ready for that kind of deep immersion. Chuck on the playlist, let's just move. And that seems like a healthy kind of entry point for a lot of people to simply move and stretch and release tension. And then there are the more senior teachers out there, and the teachers that are doing the deeper work that one can reach out for. And I used to be much more judgmental of the quicker, more distracting forms of yoga. I've kind of relaxed on my stance of that since seeing, like, no, that's okay. It's still good for people. It's better than a lot of things.
I agree 100%. Like, I really do believe that we're all bridges, that we, again, if in those, I look back at those first 8 years of my practice that were purely physical, and that wasn't like, oh, well, I wasn't doing yoga. That's all my nervous system could handle to bring me to a different place, not a better place, a different place within my practice. All that time with the extra push-ups, that was an essential part of my own maturation, as it is for everyone. My only hope for young teachers who are out there who have been given the gift to hold space is to please continue doing their own work. Do not buy the hype. Do not allow the projection that gets put upon the teacher to be a way to actually avoid having to do your own practice. It's a hierarchy that exists. Like, if you've got 10, 20, 50 people telling you that you're amazing, that becomes its own addiction. And it's really easy to stop doing your own inner work and just get fed by showing up in class and giving the student what they want, not necessarily what they need, but what they want. And as the young teacher matures and does their work, they're going to recognize the privilege of their role. They're going to take different risks only when they get comfortable with it in their own body, and be open to allowing their teaching to change and to mature as they change and mature. But I do think that there's room for all sorts of practices and different expressions. I always make jokes. Back in the 90s in Los Angeles was really like the boon of mainstream yoga. I mean, the stuff that was going on here, I often equate it to what it must have been like in the East Village in the 60s for musicians. I mean, you had some of the who would go on to become some of the most legendary yoga teachers around, all teaching together, all hanging out. There was Yoga Works where I got my training. There were just 2 studios, and it was revolutionary what was happening. And power yoga and vinyasa yoga was just becoming this thing, and it was attracting people from the gyms, people who would never do yoga were suddenly waiting, like lines of people around the block waiting to get in. It was incredible. But I used to joke, my classes were packed. Brian Kess, Steve Ross, Saul David Ray, Max Strom, Shiva Ray, Baron Baptiste, it was just, our classes were packed. And it was, the doors were locked, the music was on, the windows were shut, the heat was cranked. People were, half naked, pouring sweat. And I used to imagine teachers like Richard Freeman and Tim Miller, T.S. Little, Patricia Walden, Mati Ezrati, Chuck Miller, all the senior teachers at that time, sitting around a table. I'd imagine them, drinking their wheatgrass shots and saying, what the fuck is this power yoga vinyasa bullshit? That's not yoga. Like, why are they half naked? Put on underwear, for God's sakes. Why all that music? You can't hear yourself breathe. And yet, vinyasa flow yoga blew the yoga culture wide open in the mainstream, introduced yoga to people who would never have walked into a traditional yoga studio, opened their bodies, and in time, not all of them, but in time, led them to meditation practice, led them to yoga nidra, led them to chanting, to bhakti. Like, in time, it changed the culture of yoga for the better. So very often I imagine there's this new wave of yoga. A lot of it's on the Instagram. A lot of it it's very fast. It's not a lot of attention to alignment, to technique. A lot of linking of poses without all the structure that I'm accustomed to based on my Iyengar training. It's very showy, very flashy. I imagine me and Shiva and Baron Baptiste and Saul David Ray and Max Strom, Brian, sitting around a table, drinking our kombucha, saying, what the fuck is this bullshit? This isn't real yoga. What are they doing? Put on some clothes, for God's sake. Stop taking pictures. And I laugh at that because we have no idea how this next generation of yogis are going to influence via social media the culture of yoga going forward. And I would never want to get so rigid in my own attitude to think that any of us have truly the power to influence this magical, mystical practice that has survived for eons, that is a creative practice that is always meant to evolve, grow, and change. We all have to find our own unique niche within it, because I won't speak to all people, but those I do speak to, I will speak to their soul. In the same way, all the other teachers, in all their myriad of different flavors, shapes, sizes, colors, beliefs, they won't speak to everyone. But who they do speak to, they're going to speak to their soul. And our job is to give them the piece of information that is necessary so that they can move forward on their path, whatever that might look like, and to really just get out of the fucking way. And so I don't feel dogmatic about the yoga needs to be this one way. What I do want to encourage with young teachers is to recognize, because that's my contribution, is to understand the trauma, the mind-body connection, and how do we reframe these stories spiritually so that we can find purpose even in our pain and be proactive in that purpose for the betterment of all beings. And if I can encourage some of the younger teachers to trust their own personal development and not to be afraid to go within and to face their own shadow, I know it will impact the way in which they teach and the way in which they serve better as they go forward, and it will be more sustainable. They won't burn out.
Yeah, beautiful. Just a side note, I was just speaking with my wife, Jo, last night as we were preparing for this, and she would go to your Sunday classes at Yoga Works, and they would call it Church of Corn. And she just loved it. She went there, quote unquote, religiously. And then that's
a long time ago.
Jo Testula, she taught at Exhale as well.
Jo's your wife.
Yeah. So she sends her love, but we were just reflecting on that.
Oh, that makes me happy. Oh,
yeah.
I love Jo.
The photos that were up on the wall at Exhale, they're up here now. Yeah.
Is that true, really?
Yeah.
How great is that?
Yeah, but we were reflecting on that just epic time, and then when you came over from Yoga Works to Exhale, and what a time, huh?
It was incredible. It's still incredible. I miss those days. Every once in a while, I wish if I could go back in time, it would be Saturday at 5:30, Brian Kest's level 3 class. Those were probably the most transcendent moments in my early development spiritually that just rocked my world. Mm-hmm. And though that time can never get replicated again, but I have such a fondness in my heart for those moments. And I hope my contribution was those Sundays. I think it was at 4:00 maybe, but they were deep. They were designed. They were church. That was my hope, to the mainstream, to talk about God in the most unlikeliest of place, and help people to feel that connection.
With that being said, let's talk about God a little bit more. I remember you sharing of your experience of first really feeling God. Was it in a nightclub, and was it Billy?
Billy.
Yeah. And at that time you were atheist and you didn't have a connection with the word God. If anything, it was more of an allergy to the word God. And then he opened your eyes and your heart to God being all around, or something like that. Can you speak about that experience of God,
Sure.
God in disguise, so to speak?
Yeah. People can actually download this. It's a free chapter of the book.
Oh, great.
Go to revolutionofthesoulbook.com. They can download it for free, so they can really tease the story out, because it's a wonderful, wonderful story. And it kind of reveals a lot about my own personality, and just the lack of, I'm very grateful because I was so resistant spiritually. And like I said, I had a lot of superstition around God. God showed up when you fucked up. That's how I felt. It was patriarchal. And I didn't want anything to do with that. And so I worked at a club called Limelight. And in Limelight, there was a private club called Heaven. And it was an all-male gay sex club. And I was the only cisgendered woman who worked there. I worked behind the bar. And while I was there, met a man named Billy, African-American man, who was also in recovery at that time. So he took some issue with my drug use, but he really loved me. And what I would discover is that Billy had AIDS. And this was in the late 80s. And at that time, there was probably 40,000 reported cases. And of course, now there's 40 million. And so when Billy told me he had AIDS, I had a visceral reaction, it scared me. I recoiled. And I felt the shame of that. And, of course, Billy asked me if I wanted to understand more about the disease. And I did. And he shared all this stuff with me. And at the end of the conversation, I asked him what was going to happen. And he told me he was dying. And I asked him if he was afraid, and he said he wasn't because of his faith in God. And when he said that to me, because of his faith in God, I had another reaction. I recoiled again. But this time Billy laughed and asked me if I believed in God. And I told him I didn't, and I explained why. And he listened, and he told me afterwards that he understood. that for a really long time, believing in God was hard for him also, too. Also, as a gay man, he was ostracized from his family, from his community. He was rejected, betrayed, abused. And so for him, he had to reclaim what that meant. And so he said to me, do you want to see God now? Remember, this is probably 1:00 in the morning in a nightclub with, men chained to walls. And so I said, yeah, show me God here. And in the story, I go on to describe how Billy points to different characters in the room. Danny the Wonder Pony, for example, who was a man who used to wear a saddle on his back, and you can climb on his back and he would trot around and you can hit him with a switch. And Billy said, God's right there. And then he pointed to this person at the time we would have referred to, her name was Violet, but we would have referred to her as a cross-dresser. Now, of course, transgender woman. And Billy said, God's right there. And then Billy points to two guys in a booth, wearing suits, playfully arguing over a pitcher of beer, and said, God's right there. And then Billy took his hand and he put it on my chest, right over my heart. And he took my hand and put it over his heart. And he said, Seane, God's right here. And he said, I'm going to tell you something, and I hope you remember this for the whole of your life. And he says, ignore the story and see the soul. And remember to love, you'll never regret it. And then went on to explain to me that everyone has a story, that we're all here to awaken, to learn what love is. And what that looks like is between each person and the God of their own understanding. That all of us had lessons to learn and karma to burn, but we were all getting to the same place, which was this awakening. And that our work was not to define someone by their story or by their shadow or by your perceived understanding of what they should or should not be doing, but to really look at the soul of a human being that's constantly evolving. And that if I could, that's where I would find God. And that God was truth, and that God was love, and that this truth and love existed in all moments, all experience, all time, all place. And it didn't discern. There was no bias, there was no prejudice. And it was in that moment that Billy helped me to understand that God wasn't this I can never pronounce the word, anthropomorphic?
Nearly. Anthropomorphic. Yeah.
Thank you. I got to work on that one.
Yeah.
That God was not that God was something that awakens within each one of us, and that it was love. And that everything else was just this story that was leading us to our own personal awakening, which in yoga is the samadhi, which is enlightenment. And that was the first moment where I thought, I can get behind that. Like, I can get behind seeing God, even in the funkiest of places, that it doesn't have to be in churches or in temples or in mosques, that it can be in a sex club, which ironically was in an old church. Limelight was a church back in the day, and they turned it into a club. So heaven was in the rectory of this church. So ironically, I did find God in a church, but not quite in the way in which perhaps most people would. But it's the only way I could feel God. I had to see it in the shadows. Until I could see it in the shadows, then I knew that I could be a part of it. Because I wanted to be a part of the shadow. I'm human. I didn't want to deny my humanity. But everyone was telling me that you had to transcend that to know God. And that wasn't the truth. That you were always, God was always within you. You just had to awaken to it so that you could see it within yourself. And so that was really the turning point for me spiritually, that gave me a glimpse into what was possible. But it took me many years before I really understood the depths of this lesson, just by the way, My response would have been more like, oh, uh-huh. Like I wouldn't have been sophisticated enough to really have taken in the magnitude of the teaching that I was given. It happened as I grew and would reflect on Billy, where I thought, oh my God, that was my angel who showed up to lead me into a different understanding of God and spirituality.
Beautiful. let's come back to your book before we wrap up this beautiful conversation. So it's titled Revolution of the Soul. We've been talking about that. Soul, I think, has a similar, I love that you've brought that into the title, because it seems like there's a similar resistance to the word soul, not quite as heavy as God, but similar, So I love that, because it feels, I mean, I've got, my lineage is mainly with Ram Dass and Maharaji, and they talk a lot about soul. And so the first part, you're talking about the evolution of the soul. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Because the evolution is the revolution.
Mm-hmm.
Like I said earlier, our personal work that we do on ourselves is what's going to determine the quality of our revolution, so that we are moving towards it with more awareness and with more compassion and empathy. Because I can't care about the world truly unless I care about my own experience and journey. And so I have to move through a path that can help me to reclaim the parts of myself that are disconnected. And so the first part is the evolution of the soul. And the second part is really the now what? Now, what do we do with this? But it's also looking at the complexities, meaning that the way that I've written the book is it's 12 chapters. Each chapter is a snapshot, like the Billy story, for example. That's the first chapter. When I tell that story, I'm telling it in present time. So I'm not telling it in past tense, the way I just told the story to you. Because in past tense, I have awareness. I get like, oh, this is why this was happening. I tell the story in present time, so there's no awareness, it's just the story. But the second part of the chapter is me at this age, at 52, saying, here's what was actually happening. Like, here are the lessons that I was being given that I couldn't have known then. And I connect it back to the practices and the philosophies of yoga, like, for example, ahimsa, and show that this was the lessons. Before I even got on a mat, I was being introduced to yoga. And each chapter is like a snapshot, its own story of my own spiritual progression. And I'm trying to model back to the reader the messiness, because it is messy. But yet the other part of the chapter really lets you know, like, no, it wasn't actually. It was perfect, because then it led to this and this. So in Evolution of the Soul, it gives the different tools, whether it's dealing with trauma, mind-body connection, breath work, asana, understanding God and mysticism and where the guru is, forgiveness. All of that is with different skills, resources, not just yoga, although yoga is a huge part of it, that we can use to help us to reframe why things happen as they do. In the second part of the book, I'm starting to unpack this idea about getting off the mat and out into the world and being of service, but the complexities that exist within that suddenly a level of accountability is now even more nuanced, because now I want to go out in the world and help, but I keep fucking up. And what gets reflected back to me is in these stories is my helping without any real awareness is actually white supremacy, is actually saviorism. And here I am as a do-gooder, and yet I'm actually creating harm. And so I have to go back to the texts to look at how do we really look at things like pride and attachment and help us to take accountability for how we create harm, because it's so normalized within our system, and how to not to get so fragile within ourselves, but just to be like, oh yeah, okay, so there's my racism, there's my sexism, there's my homophobia, there's my transphobia, there's my ageism, here's all my bias. And instead of making it a bad thing, going deeper into how could I, as a white person in the dominant culture, be anything other than racist? Because if I believe in the mind-body connection, then I also have to recognize that I've also inherited my grandmother's trauma. And I've also inherited the beliefs of my school, the beliefs of my family, the beliefs of my culture, the beliefs of my religion. That includes their prejudice, their fear. So now overtly, maybe I walk around the world and I'm not actively participating in racism. Yet, put me in a situation, and I explore this in the book, chapter 12, put me in a situation where I get afraid, where the rational part of my brain suddenly turns off, the reactive part of my brain gets activated. I'm not in present time. I'm my grandmother with all of her bias, all of her prejudice in that moment. Well, that's an important moment because I might do or say something that actually can create harm for someone else. If I'm not aware of like, oh, hey, grandma, take a breath. What's really happening here? Look at that. There's your racism. All right. But don't act on it, but be in relationship with it because that's what yoga is about. It's not asking you to deny the ego. It's asking you to be in relationship with everything, the light and the shadow. And so in the revolution of the soul, the revolution is accountability. It's all of us normalizing the incomprehensible and just naming it and noticing the ways we participate in it, why we participate in it, why it's so natural for us to participate in it, and how to change those behaviors via the practice of yoga and philosophy. So it's the lessons get more complex as we mature, just as challenging, but the rate in which we figure it out gets shorter and shorter. So in the first chapter, zero awareness. By the 12th chapter, it's not that I've perfected it, but I'm able to, while simultaneously in my racism, in my classism, I'm able to see like, wow, I'm being racist. I'm being classist. Make a different choice. Investigate this. And that's what I'm trying to show people is it's not perfection, it's practice. And that's the way in which we change. And that's how we change the world. But it's got to be an individual act of it's a soul disruption. It's anarchy within ourselves. Because especially, again, someone from the dominant culture, we're protected. I don't have to do this work. Why do I need to be uncomfortable? Like, who's going to challenge me? But that's not yoga. Then I'm creating harm. So I got to go into that discomfort, just like we go into discomfort in the poses. We got to go into the discomfort of our belief system in order for there to be any true change. And that's what the book is about. That's the revolution. It begins within.
Amazing. Can't wait to read it. I've read little bits of what you've put out there so far, and it's beautiful. Really well done. And I'm super excited to dive in and gift it out as well. And yeah, what a gift. So well done and good luck for this tour ahead.
September 3rd, the book comes out. September 5th, I start my tour.
Okay.
You can buy the book now. It's on pre-sale. Hopefully one day I'll come out to Australia and I'll do a tour. I've been getting so many requests from Australia. It's like, for those in Australia listening right now, I've gotten your texts, I've gotten your emails, I've gotten your messages. Message received. It's absolutely what I, in my mind, body, have planned to come out to Australia and do readings and to share this book because out of all countries, that's the one that had been the most enthusiastic.
Great.
So
it's a big trip, so it's understandable. It takes a lot of planning, so but you can tie it into Asia and you can make it a whole world tour. Yeah.
As long as if I come out, feed me.
Yes.
Take me out to good vegan food, bring me smoothies. That's all I ask.
Beautiful. Well, Seane, thank you so much for your time. It's been great to connect. Much love.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And please give a big squeeze to Joe. And if I come, I hope to see you both.
Yeah, beautiful. Yeah. All right, Seane. Bye for now.
Bye. Take care. Blessings always.
You too. Bye.
Bye.